Man hoisted a sail long before he invented a wheel. The Polynesians, who must rank as the greatest navigators on the planet, they invented the outrigger, which is an extra hull attached to the main hull by horizontal struts. It won't, or it'll be very, very difficult to make it capsize. So they could sail very fast, very close to the wind. And they, using outriggers, went thousands of miles. And if you've been to the Pacific, obviously you have, there are very few islands and huge distances to cover between them.
How did these people do this? It's just astonishing. All right, everybody, it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. My guest today is the legendary author Simon Winchester, the author of many acclaimed New York Times best-selling books that you'll be familiar with, including The Professor and the Madman, which was made into a motion picture, The Men Who United the States, The Map That Changed the World, The Man Who Loved China, A Crack in the Edge of the World, The Perfectionists, How Precision Engineers Created the Modern World, Knowing What We Know, The Transmission of Knowledge from Ancient Wisdom to Modern Magic, which he was on the show before, so he's our returning champion. Krakatoa, I think that was the first book I read of yours, Simon. Krakatoa, another great one. But here's the new book, The Breath of the Gods, The History and Future of the Wind. Simon, you're the only person I know that could take a subject like the wind, of which I would think, how could you write a book about that and turn it into a really gripping page-turner? It was a great read.
Well, someone asked me the other day, how on earth did you manage to persuade your publishers to allow you to write a book about wind?
That's right.
I did it took a little bit of doing, I must say. They weren't initially terribly keen, but I think they're reasonably happy now.
Well, I would hope so. It's a beautifully written book, and I must say, I mean, that I've just barely scratched the surface. I'll show the audience the first 2 pages of the book is the list of all your previous books. So I barely. You must write every day for several hours. What's your routine?
Well, it's changed. I used to get up very early and write. Now I don't. I have breakfast with my wife. I live deep in the country, so I'm not easily disturbed. I think the dirt road, which is over there, has about 3 cars a day. And I, after a decent breakfast, and having read the paper and so forth, I sit down like someone going to the office, and I write until I sort of tend to write more in the late evening. So my wife is saying, come on, dinner's ready. But it's 10 o'clock till 8 o'clock at night, something like that.
Ah, that accounts for it. Yeah, Isaac Asimov he wrote like several hundred books, and I think he was an 8 to 10 hour a day writer. My friend Jared Diamond, he's very old school. He writes his books with pen and ink on a legal pad and then hands the whole thing over to his secretary who then types it out.
Well, it would be a brave secretary that never looked at my handwriting. So I'm sure he has copperplate, but not me.
So when you take on a new project like this, in this case the wind, but if you're going to write about Krakatoa, the volcano, or write about a particular person, or the creator of the Oxford English Dictionary, I mean, how long does it take you to research before you even start writing, and then how long does it take to write something like that?
Well, normally about a year, I suppose. I mean, if I write a proposal, I mean, to take the wind book, I had finished the book on knowledge, I think it was. And then I thought what had happened was I read a piece in The Guardian about some research which suggested that totally counterintuitive, the average wind speed in mainland Europe in the first 10 years of this century has actually fallen by something like 15%. And this seemed just not possible because hurricanes are getting more frequent and tornadoes and so forth. Everything seems to be getting worse and more dramatic and more fierce. And yet we're told the average wind speed is going down. We're in the grip of something called the Great Terrestrial Stilling.
Yeah,
so I thought that seems interesting. Why don't we look a bit more closely into the whole idea of wind, what it is and what is happening with it? And if so, why? And then I was suddenly seized with the idea, why not do a book? Because there have not been many books about the wind, as there's a lot of books about climate, a lot of books about weather, but not so many about wind because it's invisible and it's difficult to pin down, as it were.
So since you mentioned the Great Terrestrial Stilling, that does seem counterintuitive because we're told by climate, particularly activists, but that, the idea of a warming Earth means more heat, which is more energy into the system means more heat, which means should be greater wind speeds, right?
You'd think so, but I think there are two arguments in favor of stilling why it's happening, if it is, but that's another matter. One is that the Earth's terrestrial surface is getting more rough. There's more things to interrupt the passage of wind, not notably, of course, big buildings, big cities. But that argument of the increasing roughness of the Earth's surface doesn't really seem to hold water. But the one that does is to do with climate change. And it's not so much that the Earth is getting warmer, we all know that, but it's the differential between the really hot equatorial regions and the not as cold as they used to be polar regions. And because that differential has decreased as the overall temperature of the planet increases, it's the lower differential that seems to be causing the lowering of the wind speeds overall. However, having said all of that, the latest statistics suggest that the stilling may not be occurring as much, and it may be diminishing. And there's a new term of art being used, the Great Terrestrial Reacceleration. So this may have all been a figment of every meteorologist's imagination.
Oh my God, that's too funny. Yeah, well, yeah, measurement accuracy is everything. I mean, that's always been a complexity in climate science is, what is the temperature of the Earth supposed to be, and how would you know? And that took decades to really kind of hash all that out. And where exactly are they doing the measurements? That top of that a mountain in Hawaii is one place, and where else? And if you put your thermometers in Los Angeles, where it's all black pavement, that's going to be different than out like where you are.
Indeed. Well, in fact, I had my big birthday, my 80th birthday, on the summit of Mount Washington in New Hampshire, which is traditionally regarded as the windiest place on Earth. I mean, the highest recorded wind speed, 231 miles an hour, was recorded on the top of Mount Washington. And they take a whole host of measurements every hour, on the hour, night and day. These poor volunteers, when you see them in the middle of winter going up this sort of periscope tube out onto where the wind may be blowing. Yeah, there's a picture, I think, of the ice on the top of the Mount Washington. It is.
Yeah, that's an incredible picture.
It is, isn't it? And they have these rubber mallets that they use to bash away the accumulated ice from their instruments. So it's a brutal place, but they give us the data. And always, I don't know about your weather stations out there, but here they say, and on the summit of Mount Washington this morning, visibility may be 500 yards or something, but the wind speed, 120 miles an hour, and you think those poor people having to do that. And by the time they get down again, it's time to suit up and give up for another reading.
Oh, that's crazy. I live at the top of the mountain here above Santa Barbara, where it's pretty windy. And when I say pretty windy, I mean it gets like 30, 40 mile an hour winds, and that it is noticeable. I mean, trees fall, and it's hard to get out and walk around with the dog. And 50, 60 miles an hour, double that would just be, I'm not going outside. And then double it again and again. I mean, that's insane.
Yes, and especially if it's sort of 20 degrees below.
Yeah.
Think of the wind chill.
And why is it windier at the top of mountains? Because it's coming up the side and being pushed up?
Well, no, in the specific case of Mount Washington, which is at the northernmost chain of what is called the presidential range. And so you've got the Mount Eisenhower, Mount Reagan, and so on and so forth. Adams, of course, Jefferson, Madison.
Is there a Mount Trump yet?
There is not. I dare say there will. I'm sure it'll be a suitable color. The wind, most of the weather, nearly all the weather, in the United States is going from west to east. And most of the storm tracks, whether they're generated up in the Pacific Northwest or down where you are, down in the Southwest, most of them channel together, funnel over the Great Lakes, and then approach this great wall of mountains in New England. And there is this effect, the Venturi effect, which squeezes them between these two most noticeable peaks, Mount Washington being the northernmost, and it suddenly accelerates the wind and decreases its temperature until it gets past the mountains, and then it sort of expands again, slows down and flows out to sea. So there's a very specific reason why they chose Mount Washington as the sort of premier weather station in the United States.
Yeah. Well, since we're on that subject, I guess maybe the biggest mountain range then would be the Himalayas with Mount Everest and what that does, south of it versus north of it, and the Mongolian plains or north of that. All that is affected by that mountain range.
Well, it is. I mean, in this case, the winds are coming up largely from the south, from the Bay of Bengal, and they're often very wet winds, full of moisture. And so they dump an enormous amount of snow and ice on the slopes of Mount Everest. But interestingly, one thing about Mount Everest is particularly interesting because it is so high, 29,045 feet or something like that, that its summit is one of the few objects on the surface of the planet that pokes into the jet stream. The jet stream, there are two of them, which sweep continuously at very high speed in the lower reaches of the stratosphere. And they direct an awful lot of where the world's weather goes to. And interestingly enough, the jet stream itself was discovered in the 1930s by a Japanese researcher called Mr. Oishi. And he sent up these balloons, radiosonde balloons, which go up into the atmosphere, and they have little radio transmitters, and they will tell you what the weather is like at that altitude. And the highest ones he found, once you get over about 25,000 feet, where he was anyway, they're suddenly swept eastwards by a ferociously strong wind he never knew existed. And he said, this is a new phenomenon, and I'm going to write a paper about it. He observed it in great detail and wrote a paper naming it. He said, this I'm going to call the jet stream. And he published his paper, and no one responded. And he thought, this is peculiar, because he was a seasoned meteorologist, and he knew that the meteorological community was vibrant and intellectually alive and keen to read and indeed write about research. So he wrote another. Indeed, he wrote 18 papers, all of them saying, one way or another, I have discovered this new phenomenon. And it was only in about 1940 that it was realized by no one, or he realized no one was paying any attention, because he wasn't writing his papers in English or in Japanese, but in Esperanto, which is this unusual global language, which a lot of sort of early 20th century people thought would unite the world in peace. And he was an idealist and president of the Japanese Esperanto Society, but no one read it. And so only when it was translated into English did some people realize that there was this new phenomenon.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm just recalling one of the favorite lines from a geology book. Was it McPhee, John McPhee?
John McPhee, yeah.
Yeah, the tip of Mount Everest is marine limestone. I mean, that's deep time. That used to be underwater.
Very much. Cretaceous, full of shells and things, full of warm water.
Yeah,
gently swimming mollusks. Yes.
So he called it the jet stream before there were jets. So he must have called it that for some other reason.
Well, he knew what the jet phenomenon was, and that's
I see.
To do high-speed wind, basically.
I see.
You have a jet of water. Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if that's where the term the jet airplane comes from. Then
it does indeed, and Frank Whittle,
I see,
who invented it in England, decided, because of this very, very precise blast of air, superheated air in his case, that he would call it a jet. Yeah.
Okay, so there's so many points in your book that are so interesting. So on that particular subject, the development of the B-29 bomber, which turns out, I found out, costs more than the Manhattan Project for the United States to develop, just so it could fly, I don't know what, twice as high as the B-17 bombers. So it had to have a pressurized cabin and super expensive to build it and all that stuff. But that at that height, dropping the bombs or even making progress toward Japan, because it's in the jet stream, if you're not in the right place, you're not making any progress at all.
Well, it was actually a B-29 squadron that really discovered the jet stream, because forgetting the Esperanto papers that were already out there, one of the early bombing raids in the 1944-45 was to send a force up from Saipan, I think, to attack a radio factory north of Tokyo. And so there were about 50 aircraft. And the agreement was that they'd meet somewhere near Mount Fuji, making sure everyone was there, and then head east to the radio factory. But what they didn't know is that the altitude they were at, they ascended over Mount Fuji, took them into this phenomenon, the jet stream, and they found themselves going uncontrollably fast over the radio factory. And I think of the 500 or 600 bombs that they dropped, only 3 hit their target, because all the pilots and the bomb aimers were caught unawares by this wind that Mr. Oishi had already told us was there, but we didn't know. So the first paper in English to talk about the jet stream was indeed written by the U.S. Army Air Force.
Oh, so interesting. I guess we all know the difference, because when we fly LA to New York versus New York back to LA, it takes like an extra 45 minutes to an hour to go east, or to go west than east.
Well, I have to go relatively soon to Auckland from New Zealand from New York, non-stop.
Oh, boy.
That way, going westbound or southwestbound, is 18 hours, 15 minutes non-stop. Coming back, 15 hours. So 3 hours shorter.
3 hour difference. Yeah, that's crazy. Just other tidbits there. I didn't realize that Curtis LeMay had bombed 67 cities before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which we all hear about.
Indeed, and indeed there is something to say about the economics of all that. The weapon that they dropped over the 67 cities was, of course, not atom bombs. They were dropped in August 45 over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The bombs that were dropped over Tokyo and over Kobe and all the other cities was this new invention made at Harvard called napalm, which was this sticky, gelatinous, highly flammable, impossible to put out incendiary weapon. And the big celebrated bombing raid was in March 45, Operation Meeting House, it was called. 350 B-29s loaded with napalm bombs rained down on Tokyo, completely obliterated the city because it set up auto-generated fires. City consumed itself. 100,000 people died, many, many more than died in Hiroshima. But there's a sort of pitiless piece of arithmetic that can be done, that the cost of the atom bombs, the 2 bombs that were dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if you amortize all the development costs and everything, each bomb cost $13.5 billion. So to destroy Hiroshima, $13.5 billion. To destroy Tokyo, $85,000. A mere drop in the bucket, because fire brought just as much devastation for much less money.
And napalm is fairly cheap to make.
Napalm incredibly cheap.
Yeah. Made famous so much in the Vietnam War, but I didn't realize that it had been used so effectively. So you have a throwaway line in there about maybe we didn't need to use the atomic bombs, short of it being used for diplomacy or geopolitical purposes, which I think there's some truth to that for sure. Do you think the Japanese would have surrendered if we just kept firebombing like another 50 cities or so?
It's something my wife is Japanese American, and we talk about it not endlessly but often. And I think they would have fought and fought and fought to defend the homeland. I think most countries would be very reluctant, particularly countries so ancient and so steeped in tradition, to let another, particularly non-Asian country, take them over. They'd never been, if you remember, never been colonized by anybody. Thousands of years. I mean, so much older than most European countries. So I think they would have fought on, and that would have meant a lot of casualties on both sides. I think the Americans would have won, but it would have been a very, very much longer. And so my argument with her is that although the reasons for dropping the bombs probably had more to do with diplomacy and showing the Russians what we could do, and they better not advance any further, which they were hell-bent on occupying Japan, as you know. But it's an argument that wins you no brownie points over my breakfast table, I can promise you.
Yeah, I can see that. I didn't realize about your personal life there on that front. But I guess what I'm asking is, at some point, Hirohito hit a tipping point and said, okay, this is just, we got to quit. Why wouldn't he do that if, with the firebombing? I mean, the horrors of napalm just burning people alive. I mean, you have some descriptions of there, people just catching on fire and burning to death. That's pretty horrible. That's as bad as being radiated. Why wouldn't he stop there?
Who knows? I mean,
who knows?
Yes,
yeah.
He was exhausted. You've only got to listen to that strange, reedy voice when he actually announced the surrender on the 14th of August, having been, in the end, persuaded to. I mean, an awful lot of the war cabinet in Tokyo were determined to keep on fighting. And as you rightly say, in the end, I put my people through so much, and I'm not going to do it anymore. But who knows, if there were no more atom bombs, it might have carried on for a long while. But America had, 5 more nearly assembled bombs to go.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think that it was made clear to them that Nagasaki is not the end. And I think then he must have said, enough.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful for it. My father was on a destroyer in the Pacific, and he was with one of the carrier groups that was there to, intercept the kamikaze pilots. So there, but for the grace of the nuclear weapons go I, maybe. Who knows?
You are aware, are you not, of the origin of the word kamikaze?
Yes, the wind. Yes, I learned that from your book. Yes. Right. What is it? The mighty wind? No, not the mighty wind. It's
the divine else. Wind.
The divine wind. Yes, sorry. Yeah. Divine wind. That's right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the language itself, so you have interesting points about that. In ancient Samaria, they just didn't have that many words that we have today. So they had words for wind, rain, clouds, ice, fog, thunder, lightning, snow, but wind cannot be seen, only felt. So they had different words for that. The Egyptian hieroglyphics, Chinese symbols. One of them kind of, you have it printed in the book where, no, it's Babylonian or Sumerian, where it kind of looks like the wind. Yeah, it looks like trees that are being pushed or something like that, right?
It does. The Chinese symbol has an insect character buried inside the main character, because it was believed, wrongly, but believed that winds bring insects, I suppose, to an extent. They bring locusts and so forth. And there was an association in the Chinese mind between wind and insects. And so to this day, the character for wind, feng, which is the word for wind, dongfeng, east wind, has an insect radical buried inside it, because insects used to come with wind.
The OAD has 269 nouns and 118 adjectives, including, these are so funny, windbag, windshake, windhole, windward, puff wind, wind bladder, fuck wind, wind chapped, wind furnace, wind sucker. It's just so funny.
It goes on. I mean, there are 200 odd, so one could have filled several pages with words relating to wind.
Well, but the idea is that it's we're so ensconced in it, you don't even think about it until you start looking at the words like, oh, so this is, wind is very much a part of our culture.
Certainly is, yeah. And so many people misspell my name that they think it's Winchester with a D.
Oh, right,
it's not.
okay. Yes, I know. I understand. Yes, I can see that. Yeah, it sounds like that, though. Or downwinders. You write about the Manhattan Project and then the Nevada test site and the Bikini Atoll explosion with the Chinese or the Japanese fishing vessel.
Mhm.
Yeah,
That's
talk
fairly
about that a little
extraordinary.
bit.
That was the big bomb was called Castle Bravo, which is the biggest bomb that the Americans have ever exploded in 1952, I think, on Bikini. Um, it was a miscalculation. It was twice as large as they thought it was. It was 15 megatons TNT equivalent, and about 150 miles to the east of the test site was a fishing vessel, Japanese, called Lucky Dragon 5. And they were just getting up, putting their nets in the water or retrieving them after overnight fishing. And suddenly they saw in the west what looked like the sunrise. I think the sun had risen, so they knew it wasn't. But there was an enormous light far away on the west side. There was no sound, no blast wave, but that was the explosion at Castle Bravo. And they thought a lot of it and talked about it. But then what appeared to be like snow fell on their little boat. Large flakes of white, leafy-like substance. And they had no idea what it was. But they held out their hands and caught it. And it didn't evaporate as snow might have done or melt. And they did things which now we know what it was. We would say, no, don't do that. Which was taste it and see what it was like. Anyway, they all became very, very sick. And they sailed slowly back to Japan. And it was a couple of weeks sailing, getting sicker and sicker, losing their hair, vomiting, and all sorts of things going wrong with them. And they went to the little hospital in the town where their fishing boat was a home port. And their doctors there had no idea what this was all about. And they were sent to Tokyo. And then the Japanese doctors realized this was classic radiation poisoning, which was something that had never been known before, other than, oddly enough, in the test sites and in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But so the doctors, by now, of course, everything was peace and goodwill with the United States. And so they called in some American doctors to give them advice. And the interesting and rather cruel aspect of all this is that the American doctors were fascinated to see radiation patients, but didn't really help, just observed. I think they gave some advice, although there wasn't much advice anyone could give. And slowly, one by one, the men got better, but not in all cases. The radio operator died fairly soon afterwards. And over the years, all but one have died. Oddly enough, when I wrote the book, I thought all had died. But in Japan, someone saw the galleys of the book, said, no, there's one chap who doesn't want to be, I think I named him in the book. Anyway, he was still alive. He was clearly not going to survive very much longer because he's in his 90s. But in Japan, there is this post-war traditional belief, wrong, of course, that people that suffer from radiation sickness are contagious, and they're not. They're shunned. So people don't want anyone to know that they've been contaminated with radiation. And so this applies to people from survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but now these poor fishermen from the Lucky Dragon. So the whole thing is a sad reminder that we hope, pray, that we never, ever use nuclear weapons. I don't want to get on a pedestal here and turn this into a polemical book, but it is, everything about nuclear weapons is so ghastly.
Oh, horrible.
Inuitok, which is one of the Marshall Islands that was grievously affected by one of the test sites, the scientists refused to land for something like 72 hours while they observed the behavior of the people on the beach who had just been tremendously powerfully irradiated. And the decent people on the ship were saying, you've got to go and treat them. Just give them water or somehow help them. Said, no, we've got to watch what happens. And then eventually the Secretary of the Interior, I think it was Harold Ickes, or Ickes, over here in Washington, he said, no, I order you. you have got to land and help these people. And they took them off to U.S. naval hospitals dotted around the Pacific. But for a while, the scientists wanted to treat them as lab rats or beagles or something, just as animals to study. And he invented the science of weather forecasting. So the weather maps you see on the television or in your newspapers, the very first one was in the London Times in 75 or something, drawn by Francis Galton. And from then on, weather maps became a consequence, an essential. So he also developed the science of fingerprinting. I mean, this is a man, unfortunately, you cannot write a biography of today because he is so tainted by having been a eugenicist. I should remark, before we leave this man, one other thing he did, which I still my family use it to this day. He wrote a paper which was published in Nature, the very august science magazine, recommending that we don't cut cakes in the normal way we cut cakes. You have a circular cake, you cut a triangle out of it, thereby leaving two open faces, which will, if you leave the cake overnight, go stale. Far better way is to cut the cake with two straight knives across the equator and lift that piece of cake out and then press the two semicircles together, rotate it 90 degrees, and then the next time you cut it, use two long knives to do the same thing. And gradually the cake will always retain its circular shape and will not present a face which can go stale. And you end up with a tiny little circular cake. And you sort of bless Francis Galton. But not many people do this. We do it and people think, why are you doing that? But we explain the reason.
Yeah, that's unfortunate because pretty much everybody in that time period believed that. Those kinds of things, those eugenics type
yes, they
ideas,
did, yeah.
including progressives and liberals and people on the left in the United States all the way up until the 40s and 50s began to change that. Because you can read about the eugenics programs like the sterilization of feeble-minded in California. In fact, if I recall, one of the defenses by the Nazis at Nuremberg was, well, we got the ideas from you guys, from you Americans.
If we go down this rabbit hole a very long way, the number of ideas that the Nazis got from the Americans, not least of them, of course, being the Jim Crow laws in various southern states, applies in Germany. So we can't be too high and mighty about an awful lot of what went on in Europe in the 1930s.
And Galton was, of course, Darwin's cousin, and the fingerprinting stuff still applies. And his analysis of bell curve distributions is still relevant. A lot of the statistics, the correlation coefficient is a Galton invention. The idea of regression to the mean, which I find incredibly useful to explain things, right? So if you have, this is like the fun examples, the Sports Illustrated cover effect. This is if you're an athlete or a team and you make the cover of Sports Illustrated. I guess it's not a big deal anymore now, but that used to be a big thing. But what is it? And then they have a worse season the next after that they make the cover. So it's a curse, But in fact, all the elements that have to come together to get you to be the best you've ever been, the chances of that repeating again is very low, so you're going to regress back to your own mean. Well, and then the Galton board, you have that board with all the BBs on the top, and you just drop them down, and each one has to go around a pin, and there's a bunch of pins there, and they just naturally form a bell curve, only for the obvious statistical reason that at each pin encounter, it's 50-50 either way, and on average, you're going to go left, right, and most are going to be in the middle. The chances of going left, and end up all the way down here in this slot, which also explains height, because height is, there's not a gene for height, but there's like 1,000 genes for height. So the chances of somebody having all the genes lined up to be 7'9" or whatever are just very, very low. Or the other way.
Yeah, but the other way.
I should know parenthetically what's wrong with these arguments. The health of a genetic population, a gene pool, very much depends on diversity of all kinds. The moment you start genetically selecting for a particular trait that you want, you're going to encounter pleiotropy, in which you are selecting for a trait on a particular chromosome. Then you're going to get whatever else is also on that chromosome in some more directional fashion. The most famous example is the breeding of the silver foxes in Russia to be more tame. So you just take, the ones that are most likely to let you pet them or be touched or approach you to give them food. And then generation after generation, you just breed those, and pretty soon you have a lapdog that's, that's licking your face and cuddling with you. But they also got the curly tails and the floppy ears and the white patch on the forehead and so on. And, so this is the argument against like that guy Graham who had the Nobel Prize sperm bank in San Diego, right? Okay, maybe you want a bunch of really smart Nobel Prize winners, but these are not normal people, right? You're going to select for whatever else weird personality characteristics they have, and who knows, maybe they're on the spectrum. And so you mentioned like the wind through New York City because of all the buildings. Another fascinating area is the Dust Bowl, 1930s Depression era catastrophe in the United States. And then Roosevelt, I had no idea, he had 220 million trees planted or something to alter the distribution of the wind. And
yes, I mean, I learned about this from a friend of mine who comes from the South Dakota, and he sort of made a casual remark about, oh yes, my mother would walk down to the shelter belt. And I said, what do you mean a shelter belt? You don't know about the shelter belt? Huge lines of trees from the Canadian border, North Dakota, right down to Texas. Millions upon millions of trees were planted by the Roosevelt administration to prevent the uninterrupted flow of the wind across the prairie earth, which had been torn up by John Deere's steel-bladed plows. And John Deere's, that company and the associated ploughing manufacturers have a lot to answer for because they tore up the topsoil, which had been knitted together by prairie grasses, turned it over and planted short-term things like wheat, alfalfa, sorghum, and so forth. And of course, what it did was it loosened the soil so that the winds picked it up and blew it in all the way over to the Mississippi with these fantastic storms generating huge clouds of dust which buried pioneer villages and so on and so forth. I mean, it's Willa Cather, of course, has it, and Steinbeck more than any, describing these awful events. So the Roosevelt administration said, well, we, other than by persuading the farmers to plough more sensibly, the only thing we can do is to try and slow or stop the wind. Why don't we put up trees? And as you will well remember, or no, the Civilian Conservation Corps was this group of young unemployed men who were paid, I forget what it was, like $1 a day to do work in the fields or manual work, so long as, and I always think this is one of the charming things, they give 50 cents of every dollar, send it to their mothers, so that this spread the wealth, as it were, and they would plant trees. And the first one was planted in a little town in Oklahoma called Willow. It wasn't a willow that was put in, it was a pine, I think, of some sort. But nonetheless, Willow remains, and there's a little historical marker there which says this is the place where the first of the shelter belt trees was planted, and I think they did it over the next 5 years. And you can still see the shelter belts, as my friend from South Dakota, his mother, goes down to the shelter belt every day. And they did measurable good. The winds remained the same, but they weren't as destructive. And so eventually, these gigantic clouds, which polluted as far east as New York City, and I think I begin that chapter by describing a dust bowl cloud coming into Manhattan and forcing, streetlights to go on and cars to crash into each other. So it had an effect all over the country, but principally it ruined the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the prairies who, in their very large numbers, decided to heck with it and go off to California. And of course, that's the beginning of The Grapes of Wrath, great book, and of course a wonderful movie as well with made by John Ford. I can't remember who made it, but anyway, who made it?
Yeah, John Ford. Yeah,
amazing film. And there's this moment which I quote in the the epigraph to that chapter of one of the characters who, when Henry Fonda comes back to his home village, having been released from prison, and he finds it deserted and all the houses wrecked and full of dust and just one man there, and he says, it's the dusters, the terrible dusters. They were an awful phenomenon. Sort of, they captured everything about the Depression, its misery, its hopelessness, and the wind was central to it.
Yeah. So the terraforming worked because we haven't had another Dust Bowl since.
It did. I mean, farmers farm more intelligently today. And you've got these big rotational sprayers and things. Of course, it'll come back to bite us because the water that is damping down the dust in the prairies comes from these big aquifers. What is called the Mogollon, not the Mogollon. Anyway, there's a huge one which we're depleting at a very fast clip. So there are problems yet to come. And the other problem, which I find completely fascinating, which I don't cover in this book, is the thought that the Mississippi may break its current banks and flow west into the Atchafalaya and no longer come out into the Gulf of Mexico, if that's what we're still allowed to call it, through New Orleans, but about 50 miles to the west. That's a very real possibility. There's this huge confection of dams and locks and spillways called the Old River Control Structure, which keeps the Mississippi firmly in its banks in northern Louisiana. If that were to break, and it may well, then goodbye lower Mississippi, hello Atchafalaya. And that's where the water from Minnesota and Iowa and Kansas and so forth will ultimately end up, and New Orleans will no longer be a port.
Wow. Oh my God.
I know.
Yes. Once you undertake terraforming anything, there's going to be unforeseen circumstances and secondary causes. And then but you can't go back. We can't go back to, pre-civilization existence. So we just have to keep solving these problems going forward, I guess. We're pretty good at that as a species.
One thing I rather like, seeing as you seem to like the trivia in this book, although I will say it's not only trivia, is
no, of course not. It's a story.
When there is, it is axiomatic that for there to be wind, there has to be an atmosphere and there has to be a source of heat to get that atmosphere moving. Well, the moon has no atmosphere and consequently no wind. However, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin visited the moon in 1969, I think it was, not unreasonably, they needed to mark the moment. And what better way for Americans to mark the moment than to erect a flag? And so engineers paid a great deal of money, I did say in Houston, were set to the task of producing a flagpole which could be erected on the moon, from which could fly Old Glory. But they realized that Old Glory wouldn't fly, it wouldn't flutter, because there was nothing to blow it. So they produced a vertical aluminum pole, which Neil Armstrong was to stick into the lunar surface, and then a horizontal pole from which the flag would be suspended. But in order to give the illusion of it blowing, the horizontal pole had a slight kink in it. So you put on the rings and voila, it seems to be a fluttering flag. So the photograph was duly taken and the salutes were made and everyone was happy. Then a couple of days later, the lunar lander took off and producing from its exhaust gases the only wind the moon has ever known. And the wind did what winds invariably do, which is blow things over, including the flag. And so the flag that was so proudly hoisted fluttered to the ground and has been there ever since.
That's great. Apparently those flags are now just white, just bleached by the sun. And Yeah, again, I'm often asked, what's the craziest conspiracy theory I've ever encountered? Well, the no moonies, that we never went to the moon. One of their arguments, which is so dumb, is that, well, look, the flag is waving. So obviously they're in a studio somewhere. This is so self-refuting because, these NASA scientists were so clever to pull off the greatest conspiracy of all time to convince us all that they went to the moon when they didn't. But they're so dumb, they forgot that that people would say, hey, there's a flag waving and there's no air on the moon. Anyway.
Well, among the people that believes this now, it only came out last week, Miss Kim Kardashian, I believe, has been.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, I believe she believes that. So, need one say more.
Oh, well, but part of the clickbait culture, the economy of that is to say crazier and crazier things. That's why I don't take Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and these political commentators who rant on about the Jews are doing this and, Hitler was actually the good guy and Churchill was the bad guy. You've probably heard these,
Oh, indeed.
I'm not sure they actually believe it, right? I mean, but everybody talks about it.
For 24 hours and then they move on to something else.
Yeah, and then they move on to something else. Yeah, okay. All right, other subjects here that I enjoyed is, how do you sail into the wind? So these triangular sails that they developed. Anyway, go ahead from there.
Well, no, I'm fascinated by the whole creation of the sail and then its development. I think it was Thor Heyerdahl, the Pacific explorer, who remarked that man hoisted a sail long before he invented a wheel. So those people, particularly in Mesopotamia, who wanted to travel somewhere, rather than going to the time travel of inventing wheels and creating wheeled vehicles, you get to a river, in their case, of course, the Tigris and the Euphrates, you put a log in it and sit astride the log, and the river takes you somewhere, not necessarily where you want to go, but it moves you. So then someone had the bright idea of sticking a vertical mast, as we would now call it, into that log, and from it suspending the skin of an animal. And then you find that by moving that skin, you can direct where your craft is going to go, maybe to the other side of the river or just along it, or in certain cases against the current if the wind is strong enough to propel you. Thus was born the sail. And it was developed well enough in Mesopotamia, but really well developed in Egypt. And the felucca, which is a single-masted triangular sail boat that you find in the Upper Nile, places like Luxor, is still very much a mode of transport on that river. And of course, it gave you the ability not only to control your passage downstream with the current to Alexandria in the Mediterranean, but also upstream against the current and using the wind to help propel you. And this was a great revelation, and it developed in all sorts of ways, two very different ways in Europe and on the other side of the planet, because when the wind is blowing and you're in a single-masted, or indeed in a double-masted vessel, you will lean over, and it can get very dangerous if the wind is very strong. And so the Polynesians, who must rank as the greatest navigators on the planet, they invented the outrigger, which is an extra hull attached to the main hull by horizontal struts. It won't, or it'll be very, very difficult to make it capsize. So they could sail very fast, very close to the wind, with the wind blowing obviously not directly against them, because then you're not able to move at all, but close to the wind, which is where we get the phrase from. And they, using outriggers, went thousands of miles. And if you've been to the Pacific, obviously you have, there are very few islands and huge distances to cover between them. And yet they did, and they and their language exists in this huge triangle from Hawaii in the north down to Easter Island in the east and to what is now called Aotearoa, or New Zealand, to the southwest. Within that triangle, hardly any land surface, but a large number of people all speaking the same language, distributed by sails, by outrigger employing canoes, and by the wind. Well, then the sail developed further and further into these enormously elaborate square riggers which dominated the world's trade until the early part of the last century. And the one that I particularly like used to be moored in New York Harbor until it went back to its home port of Hamburg a few years ago. It was called the Peking, and it was a four-masted, iron-hulled, 3,500-ton vessel which carried manufactured goods from Germany through the North Sea, down the English Channel, down the Atlantic, round Cape Horn the wrong way against the prevailing westerly winds, up into the peace and quiet of the Pacific, docked in Valparaiso outside Santiago in Chile, unloaded all the German products, reloaded with guano, sea bird droppings, thousands of tons, which was brought back to Europe, this way going around the Cape Horn the right way with the wind, and fertilizing the fields of Europe with Pacific guano. And that trade employed these ships, which were unbelievably heroic in dealing with these ferocious winds around Cape Horn. And the stories, I mean, there's this, if you ever get the chance, the museum at Mystic in Connecticut produces a DVD, I think I know it's online. It's only 30 minutes, home movie, made by an American sea captain called Irving Johnson, who took a movie of himself and the ship he was on as it was going around Cape Horn. It is one of the best, most exciting marine adventure films I've ever seen. Please watch it.
Just how treacherous it is, you mean?
So treacherous, so difficult to navigate. And the strength of the men that were involved. I mean, going down, if you can imagine being in a force 12 gale in bitter cold, driving snow, the ship heeling back and forth over these ferocious waves, close to these rocks that are Cabo de Hornos, Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America, and having to haul up a sail by hand when the sail itself is stiff with ice and everything's slippery with ice, and the chances of you falling off into the sea are very high. I mean, and he would be filming. So it's an amazing film to see.
Yeah, when you fly across the Pacific, like one time I did one of these round the world trips where I was a lecturer. So we went from Chile to Easter Island, and then to Borneo, then to Australia, and you're going 550 miles an hour looking out there. There's just nothing, and it's like, how did these people do this? It's just astonishing.
The Polynesians are so amazing. I always love the moment when Captain Cook, one of the great explorers, I mean, imperial, yes, no doubt, but a great explorer, great navigator, when finally he had a Polynesian guide, not interpreter, but a Polynesian seaman that he had picked up in Tahiti. And they arrived at this, the Maori word for it is Aotearoa, which is land of the long white cloud, which is when you approach New Zealand, you just see a long, long, long white cloud. And they finally got on his ship, the Endeavour, and they came to a beach. First time white Europeans had seen these peoples who had no idea who they were. And yet the man from Tahiti was able to go to the bowsprit and address them, and they understood his language perfectly. I mean, they had had no contact for thousands of years, and yet the language had been spread by the wind with people who, and I should reiterate this, that the 1976 bicentenary of this country, the Hawaiians gave as their gift to continental US a canoe, a Polynesian canoe called the Hokulea. And they built it just as they had been built for hundreds of years past. And they decided they needed to sail it without any navigational aids from Hawaii south to Tahiti. And so they found the one man, he was in the Caroline Islands, an island called Satawal. He was called Mau Piaulug. And they went down to see him, and he had never been on a plane. He was about 75 years old, but he knew how to navigate. And so they brought him up to Honolulu, which must have been an amazing experience for him. Showed him Hokulea, can you navigate this down to Tahiti without any compass or GPS or radio, even a wristwatch, which of course you can tell the time or you can tell the direction. And he said, yes, I can. And he put a little hammock at the back near the steering rudders. And with a crew of about 50, they left Honolulu, headed south, which he knew where that was, because of the position of the sun. And 2,500 miles of open ocean. After about a month, he said, at 2:00 tomorrow morning, you will see such and such an island. And they got there. It was extraordinary. And so they've now done it. Hokulea still exists. You can still see her bobbing around in the waters of Honolulu. And he's now long dead. But the ability to navigate across these vast distances, just using things like the feel of the waves, the sound of the sea, the seabirds, the position of the stars, of course. Many, many young, courtesy of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, many young Hawaiians now know how to do it. And that, ever since Hawaii was taken over in the early part of the last century by white Americans and became a state in the 1960s, the Hawaiians have been a lost people. They've lost their identity, but through navigation, they're reclaiming it. So once again, they are hugely grateful to and dependent on the wind and are consequently fascinated by it.
Amazing. Such a great story. Have you ever read about Captain Bligh's open ocean in that little dinghy where the bounty mutineers dumped him over the side, and it was like 2,300 miles in just this little tiny boat, and managed to do it?
And I've been to, I'm going to tell you so many stories about Pitcairn, which is the island on which the mutineers, Fletcher Christian and his colleagues, ended up, and where they built a colony. I mean, one day I will tell you the story of, and I could tell you now, but I don't want to bore your listeners, Richard.
Well, but wait, you've been to Pitcairn?
I've been 3 times, yeah.
Oh my God, I want to go. So go ahead, yeah.
Well, well, this is what happened. Pitcairn now has a population of about 46 people, very small number. And a few years ago, now about 20 years ago, in fact, a police department in southern England, in Sussex, had a bit of money to spare. And they said, we've heard of this island called Pitcairn, which is a British possession, but it's never had a police officer, it never had a governor. The governor lives in New Zealand, 4,000 miles away. So why don't you, a young woman, I think her name was Constable Green, go down to Pitcairn? And you can go there by going on a freighter from Houston normally, and it will, for money, it'll stop off Pitcairn for half a day, unload things, and the islanders will come out in their longboats, pick them up and give them souvenirs and postage stamps and things. And so this young policewoman installed herself on Pitcairn Island and found, to her horror, that the men on the island were regularly sleeping with the young island girls. It was just customary. And they said, of course we are. This is the Polynesian way. And they said, well, it's not the British way, and this is a British possession, and it's against the law. So they said, well, okay, be that as it may. Anyway, 6 months later, she left, was picked up by Houston to a tanker vessel going the other way, and she went back to England and reported her findings. I mean, many other things, but this was sort of principle. And they said, well, this must not happen. And they were prosecuted. And it was decided that evidence should be gathered and the practice should be stopped. And so, to cut a very long story short, the whole court apparatus of the United Kingdom was briefly brought down to Pitcairn Island with a judge and a jury and a press and all the rest of it. And 6 men, and I think I've got the numbers right, were found guilty and sentenced to prison terms, about 5 or 10 years or something like this. But there was no prison. So they could be sent to New Zealand, but that seemed impractical and utterly likely to force the colony to die, because the men were the able-bodied men who manned the longboats, who would go out to pick up the cargo that was essential for the running of the colony. And if they couldn't come out and meet the ships, then the colony would die. So it was agreed they would build a prison And the story goes, and I like the story, so I'm going to tell it, that IKEA makes a prison in a box, and you can order a box. And so they unloaded this enormous
That's
box,
crazy.
put it into the center of Adamstown, which is the name of the little island capital. The men built their own prison, locked themselves inside, and every time a ship turned up, they were let out to pick up the cargo from the visiting ships. And thus is how they served their sentences. Eventually, they all were released, having done time, by which time all the women on the island were beyond childbearing age, and the problem was solved. And now all Pitcairn is doing is desperately keen to get people to come and live there. And ironically, they've tried all sorts of businesses, never been very successful. One of them, which they thought might do well, was growing pineapples, but the French nuclear testing at Mururoa Atoll, the prevailing winds, yet again, contaminated, it is believed, the pineapple, and so that business flopped. So now you've got a population of elderly men not having sex with anybody, with pineapples that are inedible, and dying on its feet unless they get some new blood.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, I mean, that was Fletcher Christian's first mistake, was not having a 50-50 sex ratio.
Indeed, he took his men back up to Tahiti in the ship, in the Bounty, picked up, sounds an awful thing to do, but picked up women of childbearing age, brought them back to Pitcairn and set fire to the Bounty, and it burnt the waterline, and they had no way then of getting off. So all they had to do was breathe. So Adams and Christian are the prevailing names now. Similarly to Tristan da Cunha, which is this other strange British island where there are only 7 surnames. I tell you, the legacy of the British Empire is a sad and complicated legacy.
Amazing. So you've been there. So when they drop you off, there's a little bit of a landing place, and you can hike
There
up
is.
to where the
It's called the
village
Hill
is?
of Difficulty, and you land. It really is difficult. You are rowed through the breakers. You land at the base of the Hill of Difficulty, and then scramble up the top. And then there's a lot more than there used to be, but now they have some satellite feed, and you can get cable TV. I'd say, so it's not as isolated.
Starlink.
Starlink, maybe Elon is yes,
He,
very
That'll solve that problem.
no problem.
That's amazing. Well, I want to go. This is on my bucket list. I've been to the Galapagos and Easter Island, but Pitcairn has a certain romantic notion to it in my mind. I suspect when you get there, it's like, oh, this is it. It's
I'm
probably
afraid
pretty
so.
small.
I mean, my wife and I, I wish I don't have my passport with me. I am banned from Tristan da Cunha, which is another British possession, which is the most isolated inhabited island in the world. And I've been there a number of times, but each time I go now, I'm not allowed to land, but my wife is, and so she makes faces at me. It's a long and complicated story, but basically, during the Second World War, Tristan da Cunha, which is 1,800 miles west of Cape Town, was reclassified by the British government as a ship, no longer an island with a governor. It was a ship with a captain. And so the civil administration was removed, and Naval Party, I forget what its number was, 6101, I think, was moved there with a young lieutenant in command of the island. And the idea was that it would be a place where you would observe German submarines that might be operating in the far southern Atlantic. And one of them, he was called Derek Boy, Booy, he was stationed there for 4 years. And there were 200 islanders with 7 surnames. A lot of intermarriage goes on, so they have a lot of things like retinitis pigmentosa and asthma, which are genetically, as you know better than most. And they're an unusual people. And, their looks have not been enhanced by a lot of inbreeding. However, Derek Boy, who kept a diary, fell in love with one of the girls, but of a very, very tenuous love affair. He passed her briefly in a gateway and was entranced by the smell of her hair and said hello. And she, he thinks, said hello in return. The only other time they met was when the naval party at the end of the war, a destroyer was sent to pick them up, and the naval party left the island, and all the island women lined up on the beach to say goodbye, to wave goodbye. And he saw through the foam of the spray of the waves the young girl looking at him yearningly and lowering her head, and an old woman patting her on the shoulder. From those two encounters, he surmised that she was as in love with him as he was with her. So he went back home and wrote a memoir. And in it, he talked about his love for this girl perfectly decently. Beautifully, I would say. Anyway,
that's amazing.
So I went there. That was written in about 1950, I think. And I went there first in mid-1990s. And as I landed, the magistrate, the island magistrate, said, and they speak in a strange sort of West Country of England strange accent, "Oh, Mr. Winchester, you won't be writing any of that filth from that book, will you?" And I said, "You mean,
no.
Yeah, our Emily." Emily, the girl in question, was now married to the chief islander, who was now a mature woman in her 40s, 50s. And I don't know. So when I did write the book, which was a book about the last relics of the British Empire, I quoted 2 paragraphs from Captain or Lieutenant Boy's book and thought no more about it. But then, when I went 5 years later, the radio went off on the bridge when we were approaching the island. Just, "Mr. Winchester on deck, not on board." "Yes." "Well, will you tell him he's not permitted to land on this island because of what I had done?" I've tried several times since, twice, I think, with my wife. And the last time, the administrator, the senior British diplomat on the island, was someone I knew from meeting him in Pakistan. He used to be in Islamabad. And he said, "Yeah, I very much look forward to meeting you. We can have tea and talk about old days." But then then he wrote me an email, said the island council, by this time everyone involved is dead. The chief minister is dead, Emily is dead, everyone's dead. They considered your petition to come and visit Tristan da Cunha again, but it has been decided that you won't be able to visit on this occasion, or indeed ever.
Amazing. Well, these little island communities like that might be a lesson for us in establishing a colony on Mars. Assuming you can get the oxygen and the water and the food part down, because at least these Europeans going to these islands had air to breathe, but not always water, not always drinkable water, I guess. So there's that. I wrote a paper for a collected volume called The Extraterrestrial Liberty by a British astrobiologist, Charles Cockell, who's interested in this subject. So what I wrote about, sort of lessons from Earth that we should take to Mars, was a discussion I got from Nicholas Christakis' book Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, in which he talks about a 1813 book he found titled "A Collection of Interesting Accounts of Naval Disasters, with many particulars of the extraordinary adventures and sufferings of the crews of vessels wrecked at sea and of their treatment on distant shores." So these are shipwrecks in which people survived long enough to be rescued, and then they said, well, this is what we did to solve our problems, right? So I'll just give you this because it's kind of fun. Christakis includes a table of 24 such small-scale shipwreck societies over a 400-year span from 1500 to 1900, with initial survival colony populations ranging from 4 to 500, with a mean of 119, but with much smaller numbers of rescued survivors ranging from 3 to 289, with a mean of 59, reflecting their success or failure at striking the right balance. The duration of these unplanned societies range from 2 months to 15 years, with a mean of 20 months. Some of the survivors killed and ate each other, murder and cannibalism, while others survived and flourished and were eventually rescued. What made the difference? So here's Christakis. The groups that typically fared best were those that had good leadership in the form of mild hierarchy, but without brutality, friendships among the survivors, and evidence of cooperation and altruism. The successful shipwreck societies shared food equitably, took care of the sick and injured survivors, and worked together, digging wells, burying the dead, building fires, and building escape boats. There was little hierarchy. For example, while on board their ships, officers and enlisted men were separated. But on land, successful castaways integrated everyone into a cooperative, egalitarian, and more horizontal structure, putting aside prior hierarchical class differences in the interest of survival. Camaraderie emerged, and friendships across such barriers were formed. So here's the closest thing to a controlled experiment in this category. When two ships, the Invercargill, Invercauld, and the Grafton, wrecked on the same island, Auckland, at the same time in 1864. The island is 26 miles long and 16 miles wide and lies 290 miles south of New Zealand, very isolated. The two surviving groups were unaware of one another, and their outcomes were starkly different. For the Invercargill, 19 of the 25 crew members made it to the island, but only 3 survived when rescued a year later, whereas all 5 of the Grafton crew made it to land, and all 5 were rescued 2 years later. The differential survival of the two groups may be ascribed to differences in initial salvage and differences in leadership, but it was also due to social arrangement, Christakis explains. Among the Invercargill crews, there was an every man for himself attitude, whereas the men of the Grafton were cooperators. They shared food equitably, worked together toward common goals like repairing the dinghy, voted democratically for a leader who could be replaced by a new vote, dedicated themselves to their mutual survival, and treated one another as equals, close quote. And then I write, take note, Martians, future Martians. And then I write about the mutiny on the Bounty and Fletcher Christian. So it's interesting, the differences in those outcomes.
It is. The first book I ever wrote, the editor was an English man called Charles Monteith, and Charles was a senior director of Faber, the publishing house still exists, and he tells the story of how he, back in those days, this must have been the 1950s, manuscripts that came in over the transom were often read by outside readers who would not trouble the senior editors. And he came back from lunch on a Friday, and he was going down to his country house in southwest England, and on his desk was a file folder with a manuscript inside. A file folder had sort of coffee cup stains on it, and it had evidently done the rounds. And there was a note from one of the elderly lady readers, who, and I'm sure once I tell you the following sentence, you'll know where I'm going with this. But she said, some rubbish about school children washed up on a deserted island. And for some reason, he put the manuscript into his briefcase, read it on the train going down to Gloucestershire, and on Monday morning, back in the office, telephoned William Golding and said, I would love to publish Lord of the Flies.
That's great. Yes, one of the great bestsellers of all time. Well, but in reality, that can happen, but it doesn't always happen. So this gets wrapped up into the nature of human nature. Are we good or evil, and so on? And that, civilization is a thin veneer over this, brutal, sort of a Hobbesian, nasty, brutish, and short as life would be, but not always. Yeah. There are different social structures and political systems you can have that are more successful than others.
It's an extraordinary story, and I love the fact that we're talking about this sort of thing. I'm not saying that I don't want to talk about wind, but remote islands are something my wife, I keep bringing her up, has a collection now of sweaters that she's bought in remote islands, and we love Tristan, or at least she does, but she knows it far better than I. And the Falkland Islands, I've been there many, many times, and indeed went to prison because of my...
What?
I was in prison for 3 months in southern Argentina, having been long and complicated story, but I was arrested for espionage at the time that the Argentine took over the Falkland Islands. And if you remember, we, the British, sent a task force down and threw them off.
Yes. Right.
So that was
Margaret Thatcher.
Hmm?
Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher, yes.
So they thought you were a spy for her government.
They did. And
were you?
Well, would I tell them? Of course I no.
Okay. All right.
No, I
Fair
was
enough.
not. I really was not. Although my wife still said, well, what were you actually doing down there? I was being a newspaper reporter. We got a tip that there was likely to be some trouble because there was already a confrontation brewing between a Royal Navy ship and an Argentine Navy ship over the island, another remote island, the island of South Georgia. So why did you go down and have a look? And I went down and had a look, had lunch with a friend of mine in the British Embassy in Buenos Aires, called Mark Heathcote, who I knew was a spy. So he and I went to school together. And we had lunch, and I said, Mark, all this trouble going down in the South Atlantic, is it going to spill over into an invasion? And he said, well, I can't say, but I can tell. Let me say this. There's a flight every Tuesday from a Patagonian Air Force base called Commodore Rivadavia to the Falkland Islands. And this was a Monday. It is running tomorrow. You'll be able to get to the Falklands.
Hint,
you
hint.
may not be able to get back. And that, a nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse. So I went down, and 3 days later, the islands were invaded. I watched the whole thing, got thrown off about 2 days later, did the first sort of eyewitness report of what the invasion, what it was all about, what had happened, and then went up to Buenos Aires, met up with some friends who I'd been with 2 weeks earlier in Beirut, and the three of us, all working for Sunday newspapers, and therefore having a more leisurely deadline, went back down to all the various towns in southern Argentina to look at how they were preparing for war, got arrested in Ushuaia, which is the most southerly town in the world, in Tierra del Fuego, and arrested, brought back up to Buenos Aires. We thought we were just going to be deported, but we weren't. We were then taken all the way down. It's a very long country, 2,500 miles long. And I remember they painted an X on the bulkhead in front of me, and a soldier with a rifle sat next to me, and he said, look at that X, do not look out of the window. And if I did, he'd hit me with his rifle. But
whoa.
It was very nasty. And we got quite badly beaten up and then put in prison and spent the rest of the war there.
Oh, my God, Simon, this is crazy. I have an idea for your next book.
Go on.
A memoir.
A number of people have mentioned this as a possibility. I feel if I do it, it'll be the end of everything. So I'd rather write something else and leave that in my back pocket.
I see. Well, that's how Darwin started his autobiography. I'm just going to write this for my kids. And then maybe it'll never be published or whatever. But it did, right? So people want to know. You have some great stories.
One or two.
By the way, I found the stuff on the Mutiny on the Bounty. They left Tahiti with 15 men and 11 women. Not good.
Not good.
Right.
Formula for fights in bars.
After 3 years, the woman living with mutineer John Williams died. So he took the wife of one of the Polynesian men, not good. That led to violence and jealousy. Let's see, there was a retribution for that when 5 of the mutineers were killed, including Fletcher Christian, along with all the Polynesian men. Just what a disaster. Okay, take note, future Martians. Make sure you have a 50-50 sex ratio because people are kind of fussy. All right. Let's wrap it up here, Simon. There's just so many good stories. L. Frank Baum, The Wizard of Oz, inspired by a tornado. And there's just like dozens of stories like that. The title of the book, again, The Breath of the Gods. This comes from the Spanish Armada actually being brought down by contrary winds more than the other enemy ships. King Philip says, I sent the Armada against men, not against God's winds.
The Protestant wind, of course, we always called it in Britain because it defeated the thought that Philip II might overthrow Elizabeth I and rekindle Catholicism in Britain. Not good. That's what we thought anyway.
Oh, that's funny. A Protestant win. I hadn't heard that. All right. That's great. All right, I'll put a stop there. Simon, thank you so much for your work. What are you working on next?
Well, I thought I'd take a little time off, and then I want to do the history of silver. It's never really been
Oh,
fully and properly told, I think, and would take me to some very interesting places like Potosi in Bolivia and the place in Germany where the dollar was born. And of course, it would take me to, I don't know, there's people, what they call the brothers in Texas, the Hunt brothers, who cornered the market in
right.
silver. And there's a lot of
Right.
stories to tell.
In Arizona, there's a town near south of Flagstaff, near Sedona. What's it called? It's an old silver mining town that's now you kind of go there as a tourist to see all that stuff. In fact, I think there's some of those in Nevada as well that you go to visit. They're quite intriguing, and those mines are just it's really scary
Yeah, very scary.
to go into. Yeah. All right, Simon, I'll hit the stop button there. Thank you so much for your work.
Well, it's a
I'm
great
such
pleasure.
a fan of your and again, get the book, read it. It's on audio as well. This is as good as anything you've written